The morning sun cast golden rays across the palace gardens as Queen Elizabeth stood by her bedroom window, watching the gardeners tend to the roses. At 78 years old, she had seen many sunrises, but today felt different. Today marked the beginning of preparations for her golden jubilee, celebrating 50 years on the throne. Elizabeth had never imagined she would become queen. Born as the second daughter of King George VI, she was supposed to live a quiet life away from the spotlight. But fate had other plans. When her uncle, King Edward VIII, abdicated the throne to marry an American divorcee, her father became king, and she became the heir apparent. The palace corridors buzzed with activity as servants rushed back and forth, preparing for the countless meetings that lay ahead. Lord Chamberlain Sir Michael approached the Queen with his usual respectful bow, carrying a thick folder of documents. "Your Majesty, the Prime Minister wishes to discuss the Jubilee celebrations. The people are already gathering in the streets, and we've received thousands of congratulatory letters from around the world," he said, his voice filled with pride. Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. She remembered her coronation day like it was yesterday. She had been just 25 years old, standing in Westminster Abbey with the weight of the crown both literally and figuratively on her shoulders. The entire nation had watched as she took her oath, promising to serve her people with unwavering dedication. As she walked through the palace halls, memories flooded back. She recalled the early days of her reign, when everything seemed overwhelming. The weekly meetings with Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had been like a grandfather to her, teaching her the intricacies of governing. She remembered how he would arrive with his cigars and wise words, helping her navigate the complex world of politics and diplomacy. The Queen paused at a portrait of her late father. King George VI had been her greatest inspiration. Despite his speech impediment and natural shyness, he had led the nation through World War II with remarkable courage. Elizabeth remembered the nights they spent in the underground shelters during the London Blitz, where her father would tell stories to keep her and her sister Margaret calm while bombs fell overhead. "Your Majesty?" Sir Michael's gentle voice brought her back to the present. "The Archbishop of Canterbury has arrived for your meeting." Elizabeth straightened her shoulders and walked toward the throne room. The Archbishop, a kind man with silver hair and warm eyes, had known her since her coronation. He had been the one to place the crown on her head all those years ago. "Your Majesty, it's wonderful to see you," the Archbishop said with a warm smile. "The preparations for the Jubilee service are proceeding beautifully. I wanted to discuss the special prayers and readings for the ceremony." As they talked, Elizabeth's mind wandered to all the changes she had witnessed during her reign. When she became queen, television was still a new invention, and many people didn't own cars. Now, the world was connected by something called the internet, and people carried phones in their pockets that could take pictures and send messages instantly. She had seen 13 different prime ministers serve under her, each bringing their own challenges and triumphs. From the Suez Crisis in the early years to the Falklands War, from the troubles in Northern Ireland to the fall of the Berlin Wall, she had been a constant presence through it all. The Queen remembered the day when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. She had watched it on television with Prince Philip and their children, marveling at human achievement. Prince Charles had been 21 then, and she remembered how excited he was about space exploration. Speaking of Philip, she smiled thinking about her husband. They had married in 1947, just 2 years after the end of World War II. Philip had given up his naval career and his Greek royal titles to marry her, a sacrifice that she never forgot. He had been her rock through all the difficulties of royal life, always ready with a joke or a word of encouragement when the pressure seemed too much. The Archbishop continued discussing the Jubilee plans, but Elizabeth's thoughts drifted to her children. Charles, now in his 50s, was preparing to be king himself one day, and, always the most independent of her children, had made her proud with her charitable work and Olympic achievements. Andrew had served bravely in the Falklands War, and Edward was pursuing his interests in the arts. But, perhaps most importantly, she thought about her grandchildren. William and Harry brought such joy to her life, and she loved watching them grow up in the palace gardens where she herself had played as a child. They reminded her that the monarchy would continue long after she was gone, adapting to new times while maintaining the traditions that had served the nation well. As a meeting with the Archbishop concluded, Elizabeth walked to her private study. The room was filled with photographs of her family and mementos from her travels around the world. She had visited over 120 countries during her reign, meeting presidents and prime ministers, tribal chiefs, and religious leaders. Each journey had taught her something new about the diverse world she served. The Queen picked up a letter from her desk, one of thousands she received each week from ordinary citizens. This one was from a young girl in Manchester who had written to thank her for visiting their school the previous year. The child had drawn a picture of the Queen wearing her crown, with a big smile on her face. These letters always touched Elizabeth's heart. They reminded her that beyond all the ceremonies and state functions, her role was fundamentally about serving the people. Every decision she made, every appearance she attended, every word she spoke was done with the welfare of her subjects in mind. As evening approached, the Queen prepared for dinner with her family. Prince Philip would regale them with stories from his day, probably involving some amusing encounter with palace staff or a humorous observation about modern technology. Charles would update her on his charitable work, and might share news from her equestrian activities. These family dinners were precious to Elizabeth. Despite the grandeur of palace life, she treasured the simple moments of being a wife, mother, and grandmother. She remembered her own childhood dinners at the palace, where her father would ask about her lessons, and her mother would ensure she minded her manners. Before retiring for the evening, the Queen always reviewed her red boxes, the official government documents that required her attention. Even after 50 years, she read every paper carefully, fulfilling her constitutional duty to be consulted, to encourage, and to warn her ministers. As she prepared for bed, Elizabeth reflected on the day's events and the Jubilee preparations ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve. She thought about the millions of people who look to the crown for stability and continuity in an ever-changing world. The Queen said her prayers, as she had done every night since childhood. She prayed for her family, for her people, and for the wisdom to continue serving with the same dedication she had promised 50 years ago. Outside her window, London slept peacefully, knowing that their sovereign was watching over them, just as she had done for half a century, with constant love and unwavering loyalty. 3 weeks before the Jubilee ceremony, Queen Elizabeth sat in the drawing room with her private secretary, reviewing the guest list for the celebration. Representatives from every Commonwealth nation would attend, along with foreign dignitaries, religious leaders, and members of Parliament. The logistics were staggering, but the Queen had learned long ago that attention to detail was crucial for successful royal events. Your Majesty, we've received confirmation from the Prime Ministers of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, her secretary informed her. They're particularly excited about the special exhibition showcasing 50 years of Commonwealth achievements. Elizabeth smiled, remembering her first Commonwealth tour as a young queen. She had traveled to Australia and New Zealand in 1954, the first reigning British monarch to visit those nations. The enthusiasm of the crowds had been overwhelming. In Sydney, nearly 1 million people had lined the streets to catch a glimpse of their young queen. That tour had taught her valuable lessons about the importance of being seen by her people. Television was becoming popular, but nothing could replace the personal connection of meeting subjects face to face. She made a mental note to ensure that during the Jubilee celebrations, there would be plenty of opportunities for the public to participate. Prince Philip entered the room, his silver hair neatly combed, and his posture still remarkably straight despite his age. "The BBC wants to know if you'll agree to that documentary they proposed," he said, settling into his favorite armchair. "Something about your daily life and the work you do that people don't usually see." Elizabeth considered this carefully. She had always been private about her personal life, believing that mystery and dignity were essential to the monarchy's effectiveness. But perhaps after 50 years, People deserve to understand what their queen actually did every day. "What do you think, Philip?" she asked, valuing his opinion above all others. "I think people would be surprised to learn how many hours you spend reading government papers and how many letters you personally review," he replied with a grin. "They might finally understand that being queen isn't all tiaras and garden parties." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Prince Charles, who had been meeting with Jubilee organizers downtown. His face was flushed with excitement, and he carried a folder full of photographs and planning documents. "Mother, you should see the rehearsal for the cultural celebration," Charles said, spreading the images across the coffee table. "They've organized a pageant showing the evolution of British culture over your 50-year reign. There are dancers representing the 1950s, musicians from the 1960s, and even a section dedicated to the technological advances we've seen." Elizabeth examined the photographs with interest. She could see elaborate costumes and stage sets that would tell the story of her reign through art and performance. It was a creative way to help people understand just how much had changed during her time on the throne. She remembered the early days when rock and roll was considered scandalous, when the Beatles were just four young men from Liverpool who would revolutionize music. She had awarded them MBEs in 1965, despite criticism from some traditionalists who thought popular musicians didn't deserve royal recognition. "There's also going to be a special section honoring the role of women in society," Charles continued. "They want to highlight how women's roles have transformed during your reign, from a 1950s housewife ideal to women becoming prime ministers, astronauts, and business leaders." This touched Elizabeth deeply. As a woman who had taken the throne in an era when women were expected to be wives and mothers first, she had worked hard to demonstrate that gender didn't determine capability. She thought of Margaret Thatcher, Britain's first female prime minister, with whom she had shared a complex but respectful relationship. The Queen's lady-in-waiting entered quietly, carrying the afternoon's correspondence. "Your Majesty, there's a particularly touching letter I thought you might want to see immediately," she said, handing over a cream-colored envelope. The letter was from a 90-year-old woman named Dorothy from Yorkshire. Dorothy wrote that she had been present at Elizabeth's coronation as a young woman and had followed her reign with admiration ever since. She explained that she was now too frail to travel to London for the Jubilee, but wanted the Queen to know how proud she was of her service to the nation. Dorothy mentions that her late husband served in World War II and always said you reminded him of the values they fought to protect. Elizabeth read aloud. She says watching you handle every crisis with grace gave her strength during difficult times in her own life. Philip leaned over to read the letter. "Remarkable," he said quietly. 50 years of making a difference in people's lives, one day at a time. These personal connections were what made the crown meaningful to Elizabeth. She wasn't just a symbol or a figurehead. She was a source of stability and continuity for millions of people who had grown up with her as their queen. The afternoon brought a meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury and other religious leaders who would participate in the Jubilee service. The ceremony would take place at St. Paul's Cathedral, the same church where she had celebrated her silver Jubilee 25 years earlier. "Your Majesty, we've been discussing the themes for the service," the Archbishop began. "We want to focus on service, dedication, and the concept of covenant between sovereign and people." Elizabeth nodded approvingly. The idea of covenant had always been central to her understanding of monarchy. It wasn't about power or privilege. It was about mutual responsibility and service. She served her people, and they in turn supported the institutions that provided stability to the nation. "I'd like the service to acknowledge the challenges we've faced together," she said thoughtfully. "The economic difficulties, the social changes, the moments when we've had to adapt and grow. This hasn't been 50 years of smooth sailing." She was thinking of the 1970s oil crisis, the recession of the early 1980s, the poll tax riots, and countless other moments when the nation had been tested. Through each crisis, she had tried to be a steadying influence, showing that some things remained constant even when everything else seemed to be changing. That evening, The Queen took her traditional walk through the palace gardens with her corgis. The dogs, descendants of Susan, the corgi she had received for her 18th birthday, trotted beside her as she reflected on the preparations for the Jubilee. She passed the rose garden where she had posed for her coronation portraits, now in full bloom with varieties that hadn't existed when she first became queen. The gardens themselves told the story of her reign, with trees planted to commemorate various milestones and flower beds redesigned to reflect changing tastes and environmental awareness. In her private apartments that evening, Elizabeth opened one of her red boxes and found a memo from the Cabinet Office about proposed changes to the civil list, the funding arrangement for the royal family. Even during Jubilee preparations, the business of government continued, requiring her careful attention and constitutional guidance. She also reviewed briefing papers for upcoming state visits and Commonwealth meetings. Being queen meant understanding global politics, trade relationships, and diplomatic sensitivities. Every conversation she had with foreign leaders carried weight, and she took this responsibility seriously. As she prepared for dinner, Elizabeth chose to wear a simple dress rather than formal attire. Tonight would be a quiet family meal, a chance to hear about her grandchildren's activities and Philip's latest projects. These moments of normalcy were precious amid the pageantry of royal life. During dinner, William, now 19 and studying at university, shared stories about his courses and his friends' reactions to having a prince as a classmate. Harry, 17 and full of energy, talked about his sports activities and his growing interest in military history. "Grandmother," William said as dessert was served, "my friends keep asking what it's like having you as a grandmother. They can't imagine having dinner with the Queen every week." Elizabeth laughed softly. "I hope you tell them that grandmothers are grandmothers, whether they wear crowns or not. The important thing is family, not titles." This was something she had learned from her own relationship with her grandmother, Queen Mary, who despite her formidable public presence had been a loving and supportive influence in Elizabeth's life. She wanted to pass on that same sense of family connection to the next generation. Later that evening, as the palace settled into quiet, Elizabeth reviewed her speech notes for the Jubilee ceremony. She wanted her words to reflect both gratitude for the past and hope for the future. The speech needed to acknowledge the changing world while affirming the timeless values that the monarchy represented. She thought about the young woman who had become queen in 1952, uncertain and overwhelmed but determined to serve. That woman had grown into someone confident in her role, seasoned by experience, and still committed to the oath she had taken 50 years ago. As Big Ben chimed midnight, marking another day closer to the Jubilee, Queen Elizabeth said her prayers and settled into sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve her people with the same dedication that had defined her remarkable reign. The day before the Jubilee ceremony, London was transformed. Red, white, and blue bunting decorated every street, and thousands of people had already begun camping along the processional route to secure the best viewing spots. From her palace windows, Queen Elizabeth could see the crowds gathering, their enthusiasm evident even from a distance. She had woken early, as was her custom, and spent the morning in final preparations. Her dresser had carefully laid out the outfit she would wear tomorrow, a pale gold coat and matching hat, chosen because gold represented the 50th anniversary. The ensemble was elegant, but not overly formal, reflecting her desire for the celebration to feel accessible to everyone. "Ma'am, the final rehearsal went perfectly," reported her private secretary as she reviewed the ceremony schedule one last time. "The timing is precise, and all the foreign dignitaries have arrived safely." Elizabeth nodded, though her mind was focused on something beyond logistics. She had spent the morning reading letters from citizens across the Commonwealth, each sharing personal stories about what her reign had meant to them. A teacher from Jamaica wrote about how the Queen's visit to her school had inspired her to pursue education. A veteran from Canada described watching her coronation on television as a young soldier and feeling proud to serve under her command. These stories reminded her that tomorrow wasn't really about her. It was about the relationship between the crown and the people. For 50 years, she had tried to embody the values and aspirations of the nation she served. The Jubilee was an opportunity to celebrate that partnership and look forward to the future. Prince Philip found her in the library, surrounded by photo albums from various state visits and royal tours. Looking back, he asked, settling beside her on the sofa. Remembering, she corrected gently. Do you recall our first visit to India in 1961? I was so nervous about meeting Prime Minister Nehru and representing Britain in a nation that had recently gained independence. Philip smiled at the memory. You charmed everyone, especially when you wore that beautiful sari to the state banquet. Nehru told me later that it showed respect for Indian culture in a way that made a real difference. Elizabeth turned to a photograph from that trip, showing her and Philip riding an elephant during their tour of Rajasthan. She looked so young in the picture, barely 35, but already carrying herself with the dignity that would define her reign. That visit had taught her the importance of adapting royal traditions to show respect for different cultures while maintaining her role as head of the Commonwealth. The world was so different then, she mused. We flew everywhere in small planes, staying in basic accommodations compared to what's available now. But perhaps those challenges brought us closer to the people we met. The afternoon brought a private tea with former prime ministers who had served under her. Harold Wilson, now in his 80s but still sharp, regaled the group with stories from the 1960s and 1970s. Your Majesty, I'll never forget our weekly audiences during the economic crisis of 1976, he said with a chuckle. You always ask the most insightful questions about unemployment figures and inflation rates. Margaret Thatcher, elegant as always despite her years, added, the Queen's understanding of constitutional law and government procedure has been invaluable to every prime minister. She's seen 13 of us come and go, providing continuity that no other institution can offer. John Major, the most recent former prime minister present, spoke about the Queen's role during the difficult 1990s when the royal family faced intense media scrutiny. Your Majesty's dignity and composure during that period helped the monarchy emerge stronger, he said respectfully. Elizabeth appreciated these observations, but felt slightly uncomfortable with praise. In her mind, she had simply done her duty, maintaining the standards expected of the crown regardless of personal cost. The constitutional crisis following Diana's death had been particularly challenging, requiring her to balance traditional protocol with public expectations and genuine grief. That evening brought the final family gathering before the ceremony. All of Elizabeth's children and grandchildren assembled in the private dining room, a rare occurrence given everyone's busy schedules. Charles brought his sons William and Harry, while Anne arrived with her children Peter and Zura. Andrew's daughters Beatrice and Eugenie, though still quite young, were excited about participating in tomorrow's celebration. Grandmother, will there be fireworks? Asked 8-year-old Eugenie, her eyes bright with anticipation. There will indeed be fireworks, Elizabeth replied, and music and dancing in the streets. The whole country is celebrating 50 years of working together. Margaret, the Queen's younger sister, raised her glass in a toast. To Elizabeth, who has given her life to service with more grace than any of us could have imagined when we were children playing in these very rooms. The toast was echoed around the table, but Elizabeth felt emotional rather than celebratory. These people were her foundation, the ones who knew her not as a monarch, but as a wife, mother, grandmother, and sister. Their love and support had made it possible for her to fulfill her public role with confidence. After dinner, Elizabeth retreated to her study to review her speech one final time. The words had been carefully crafted to thank her subjects while looking ahead to the challenges and opportunities that lay before the nation. She wanted to acknowledge that 50 years was a significant milestone, but emphasized that her commitment to service remained as strong as ever. Tomorrow we celebrate not just 50 years of my reign, but 50 years of progress, achievement, and shared purpose, she practiced aloud. We have faced challenges together and emerged stronger. We have celebrated triumphs together and shared in the joy of national accomplishment. She paused at the section addressing the Commonwealth, which had grown from the remnants of empire into a voluntary association of independent nations. The Commonwealth represents the best of our shared values: democracy, human rights, and mutual respect. It shows the world that nations can work together as equals, regardless of size or wealth. The speech also touched on the role of young people in shaping the future. Elizabeth had always believed that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to remain relevant to new generations. Tomorrow's ceremony would include young performers and representatives from schools and youth organizations across the country. As midnight approached, Elizabeth took her traditional evening walk through the palace corridors. The building was quieter than usual, with most staff having gone home early to prepare for tomorrow's early start. She passed portraits of her predecessors, monarchs who had faced their own challenges and celebrations throughout British history. She paused before a painting of Queen Victoria, who had reigned for 63 years and faced the enormous social and technological changes of the 19th century. Victoria had been Elizabeth's great-great-grandmother and an inspiration in showing how a female monarch could adapt to changing times while maintaining the dignity of the crown. In her bedroom, Elizabeth's personal maid had laid out everything needed for tomorrow, including the jewelry she would wear. She had chosen pearls rather than diamonds, wanting to project accessibility rather than grandeur. The pearls had been a gift from her father on her 21st birthday, making them especially meaningful for this milestone celebration. Before retiring, she reviewed her schedule one final time. The day would begin with a private service at Westminster Abbey, followed by the public ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral, then a carriage procession through London, concluding with a balcony appearance at Buckingham Palace and evening fireworks. Each element had been designed to include as many people as possible while maintaining the dignity expected of royal occasions. The ceremony would be broadcast to millions around the world, but Elizabeth was most concerned about the thousands who would line the streets of London to participate in person. She thought about Dorothy, the 90-year-old woman from Yorkshire who had written such a touching letter. Tomorrow's celebration was for people like Dorothy, who had shared in the joys and sorrows of the past 50 years and deserved to feel proud of their nation's achievements. As she said her prayers that night, Elizabeth included special gratitude for the opportunity to serve and hope for wisdom in the years ahead. She had no intention of slowing down simply because she had reached this milestone. There was still work to be done, still ways to serve her people and support the institutions that had served Britain so well. Outside her windows, London hummed with anticipation. Street parties were being organized in neighborhoods across the capital, and similar celebrations were planned in towns and cities throughout the Commonwealth. Tomorrow would be a day of shared joy, a moment when an entire nation could pause to appreciate how far they had come together. Queen Elizabeth fell asleep, knowing that she had given her best effort to fulfill the promise she had made 50 years ago. Tomorrow would celebrate not just her service, but the partnership between Crown and people that had made that service meaningful and effective. The Jubilee belonged to everyone who had contributed to Britain's success over the past 5 decades. Jubilee morning dawned bright and clear, with early summer sunshine casting a golden glow over London. Queen Elizabeth woke at 6 o'clock, 2 hours earlier than usual, feeling a mixture of anticipation and solemnity. Today would be one of the most significant days of her reign, marking 50 years of service to her people. As she looked out her bedroom window, she could already see crowds gathering along the mall, many having slept overnight to secure prime viewing positions. The dedication of these people, who had given up comfort and sleep just to catch a glimpse of their queen, moved her deeply. It reminded her why she had devoted her life to serving them. Her dresser arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, carrying the pale gold outfit that had been selected months earlier. As Elizabeth prepared for the day, she reflected on other significant mornings in her life. her wedding day in 1947, her coronation in 1953, and the morning she had learned of her father's death, which had changed her life forever. The weather forecast remains excellent, Your Majesty, her private secretary informed her during breakfast. The police report that crowds are larger than expected, but remarkably orderly. There's a genuine sense of celebration in the air. Prince Philip joined her for breakfast, looking distinguished in his naval uniform. Despite being 79 years old, he moved with the energy of a much younger man, sustained by his sense of duty and his love for his wife. The newspapers are full of praise this morning, he told her. The Times calls you the embodiment of national values, and The Guardian praises your unwavering commitment to constitutional democracy. Elizabeth smiled, but remained focused on the day ahead rather than media coverage. She had learned long ago that press opinions could change quickly, but the relationship with her people was what truly mattered. Today was about celebrating that relationship and renewing her commitment to serve. The first event was a private Thanksgiving service at Westminster Abbey, attended only by family members and close staff. This intimate ceremony allowed Elizabeth to begin the day with prayer and reflection before the public celebrations began. As she knelt in the same church where she had been crowned 50 years earlier, she felt the weight of history and the blessing of being able to serve for so long. Archbishop Runcie, who had officiated at Prince Charles's wedding to Diana, led the service with readings focusing on service and dedication. We give thanks for 50 years of faithful service, he prayed, and we ask for continued wisdom and strength for the years ahead. After the private service, the royal family traveled to St. Paul's Cathedral for the main Jubilee ceremony. The streets were lined with cheering crowds, many waving small Union Jack flags that had been distributed by local councils. Children sat on their father's shoulders to get a better view, while elderly veterans stood at attention as the royal car passed. Elizabeth waved continuously during the journey, making eye contact with as many people as possible. She noticed a group of school children holding a banner reading, "Thank you for 50 years, Your Majesty," and made sure to acknowledge them with a special wave. These personal connections, multiplied thousands of times over the years, were what made her role meaningful. St. Paul's Cathedral had been beautifully decorated for the occasion, with flowers from every part of the Commonwealth creating a magnificent display. As Elizabeth entered the cathedral, the congregation of 2,000 people rose as one, representing every aspect of British and Commonwealth society. The ceremony began with the hymn, "Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven," which had been sung at her wedding and coronation. As the familiar words filled the cathedral, Elizabeth felt connected to all the significant moments of her life and the continuous thread of faith that had sustained her through difficulties and triumphs alike. During the service, representatives from various charities and organizations spoke about the Queen's support for their work. A nurse from Great Ormond Street Hospital described how royal patronage had helped them develop new treatments for seriously ill children. A representative from the Prince's Trust explained how the royal family support had helped thousands of young people start businesses and develop skills. These testimonials reminded Elizabeth that the monarchy's value lay not in ceremony, but in its ability to spotlight important causes and encourage charitable giving. Over 50 years, royal patronage had helped raise millions of pounds for causes ranging from medical research to environmental conservation. The Archbishop of Canterbury delivered a sermon focusing on the concept of covenant between ruler and people. "Your Majesty has shown us that leadership is not about power over others, but about service to others," he said. "For 50 years, you have demonstrated that true authority comes from dedication to duty and love for those you serve." When it came time for Elizabeth to speak, she approached the pulpit with the same composure she had shown throughout her reign. Her speech, carefully crafted over weeks of preparation, spoke from the heart while maintaining the dignity expected of the occasion. 50 years ago, I made a promise to serve you with all my heart and all my strength," she began, her voice clear and strong despite the emotion she felt. "Today I renew that promise. The world has changed dramatically during my reign, but the values that bind us together remain constant: duty, service, compassion, and respect for one another. She spoke about the Commonwealth's evolution from empire to partnership, praising the way former colonies had become independent nations while choosing to remain connected through shared values. The Commonwealth shows the world that cooperation is stronger than conflict, and that diversity is a source of strength rather than division. The Queen also addressed young people directly, acknowledging their role in shaping the future. To the young people of our nations, I say this: the future belongs to you, but it will be built on the foundation of values we have developed together. Democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are not just British or Commonwealth values. They're human values that require constant defense and development. As the ceremony concluded, the congregation sang "God Save the Queen" with particular enthusiasm, their voices echoing through the cathedral and out to the crowds gathered in the streets. Elizabeth felt deeply moved by the obvious affection and respect in their voices. The procession from St. Paul's to Buckingham Palace took over an hour as the royal carriage moved slowly through streets packed with well-wishers. Elizabeth and Philip waved constantly, their faces aching from smiling, but their spirits lifted by the genuine warmth of the crowds. Along the route, she noticed groups representing every aspect of British society: families with young children, elderly couples holding hands, teenagers with painted faces, veterans in uniform, and immigrants who had made Britain their home. This diversity was one of the great changes of her reign, and she was proud that the monarchy had evolved to represent everyone. At one point, the procession paused to allow a group of disabled children to present flowers to the Queen. As she accepted the bouquet from a young girl in a wheelchair, Elizabeth was reminded of the many hospital visits and charitable events that had been among the most meaningful aspects of her role. The crowd sang patriotic songs and chanted "Long Live the Queen" as the procession continued. Street parties had been organized in neighborhoods throughout the city, with tables set up on closed roads where neighbors shared food and celebrated together. The Jubilee had brought communities together in a way that reminded Elizabeth of the spirit she had seen during World War II. When the royal carriage finally arrived at Buckingham Palace, thousands of people filled the space in front of the building, all hoping for a glimpse of their queen. As Elizabeth stepped out of the carriage, the cheering reached a crescendo that could be heard blocks away. The balcony appearance was scheduled for later in the afternoon, but first, the royal family gathered inside the palace for a private lunch. Despite the grandeur of the day's events, this family time was precious to Elizabeth. Her grandchildren were excited to share stories from watching the crowds, and Prince Philip regaled everyone with observations about the ceremony. As the afternoon continued, Elizabeth prepared for the final public appearances of the day. The balcony scene would be followed by a concert in the palace gardens and fireworks over London. She was tired, but energized by the overwhelming positive response from her people. Looking out at the crowds still gathered below, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to serve and for the support she had received throughout her reign. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but today had shown that the partnership between Crown and people remained as strong as ever after 50 remarkable years. As evening approached on Jubilee Day, Queen Elizabeth stood behind the curtained doors leading to the famous Buckingham Palace balcony. Through the windows, she could hear the enormous crowd that had gathered in front of the palace, their voices creating a constant hum of excitement and anticipation. This moment had been the culmination of months of planning, but it represented something far more significant than any single celebration. Prince Philip stood beside her, along with Prince Charles, Princess and Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward. Her grandchildren, including young William and Harry, fidgeted with excitement at being part of such a historic moment. "Ready, everyone?" Elizabeth asked, though she knew this was more than a question about timing. It was about stepping forward together as a family to meet their people. As the palace doors opened and the royal family stepped onto the balcony, the roar from the crowd was deafening. Thousands of faces looked up at them, many holding cameras to capture this moment, while others simply waved flags and cheered with pure joy. Elizabeth felt overwhelmed by the warmth and affection radiating from the people below. She had appeared on this balcony countless times during her 50-year reign, after her coronation, during royal weddings, following military victories, and during times of national celebration and mourning. Each appearance had been a moment of connection with her subjects, but today felt especially meaningful because it represented the culmination of half a century of shared experience. The crowd began chanting, "We love you, ma'am," and "Thank you." Elizabeth waved continuously, making eye contact with individuals in the crowd whenever possible. She noticed elderly veterans standing at attention, families with children on shoulders, and groups of young people singing patriotic songs. The diversity of faces reminded her of how much British society had changed during her reign, becoming more multicultural and inclusive. After several minutes of waving and acknowledging the crowd's enthusiasm, Elizabeth stepped forward to speak briefly to the assembled thousands through a microphone system that carried her voice across the palace grounds and to the millions watching on television around the world. "My dear people," she began, her voice carrying clearly despite the emotion she felt. "Today has been a day of celebration, but more importantly, it has been a day of gratitude. For 50 years, you have supported me, encouraged me, and worked with me to build the nation we are today. This Jubilee belongs to all of us." The crowd quieted respectfully as she continued. "We have faced challenges together and celebrated achievements together. We have shown the world that a constitutional monarchy can evolve and adapt while maintaining the values that make us strong. As I look out at your faces today, I see the future of our great nation, and I am filled with hope and confidence." She concluded by saying, "God bless you all, and thank you for 50 wonderful years of partnership and service." The crowd erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. As the royal family remained on the balcony, a specially organized fly-past began overhead. Aircraft from the Royal Air Force roared above the palace in precise formation, trailing red, white, and blue smoke across the clear evening sky. The sight was spectacular, but Elizabeth was more focused on the faces below than the display above. The evening's celebrations continued with a concert in the palace gardens, featuring performances representing music from each decade of her reign. As Elizabeth watched from the royal box, she heard songs that brought back memories of significant moments. The Beatles' music from the revolutionary 1960s, Queen's anthems from the proud 1970s, and more contemporary artists representing the modern era. Between musical performances, various celebrities and public figures spoke about the Queen's impact on their lives and careers. Sir David Attenborough, the beloved naturalist whom Elizabeth had knighted for his environmental work, spoke about her personal commitment to conservation. "Your Majesty has been a patron of the natural world for 50 years, he said, supporting scientific research and environmental protection long before it became fashionable. Other speakers included representatives from the Queen's many charities, young people who had benefited from royal programs, and Commonwealth leaders who described how her support had helped their nations develop and prosper. Each testimony reinforced the message that the monarchy's value lay in its service to others rather than any personal benefit. As the concert concluded, preparations began for the evening's fireworks display. Elizabeth returned to the palace balcony, now illuminated by special lighting that made the building glow against the darkening sky. The crowd had grown even larger during the evening, with people continuing to arrive from across London and beyond. The fireworks began with a crescendo of color and sound that lit up the entire city. From her balcony position, Elizabeth could see the lights reflecting off buildings throughout central London, and she knew that millions of people were watching from rooftops, parks, and windows throughout the capital. The display was magnificent, but what moved her most was the sense of shared joy and celebration that permeated the entire city. During the fireworks, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She remembered the frightened young woman who had become queen unexpectedly, learning to navigate the complexities of constitutional monarchy while raising a family and adapting to rapid social change. That woman had grown into someone confident in her role and secure in her relationship with her people. She thought about the prime ministers who had guided the nation during her reign, from Winston Churchill's wisdom through Margaret Thatcher's determination to the current leadership's efforts to position Britain for the future. Each had brought different perspectives and challenges, but all had worked within the constitutional framework that made British democracy stable and effective. The Queen also reflected on the Commonwealth's evolution during her reign. What had begun as an association of former British colonies had developed into a voluntary partnership of independent nations choosing to work together for mutual benefit. This transformation represented one of her proudest achievements, showing that imperial relationships could evolve into partnerships based on equality and shared values. As the fireworks reached their climax, Elizabeth thought about her family and the sacrifices they had all made for public service. Philip had given up his naval career to support her role. Charles had waited patiently for his turn to serve while preparing himself thoroughly for kingship. All of her children had accepted the responsibilities and restrictions that came with being royal, understanding that their lives belonged partly to the nation. The display concluded with a spectacular finale that spelled out ER 50 in lights across the sky, representing Elizabeth Regina's 50 years on the throne. As the last fireworks faded and the crowd began to sing God Save the Queen one final time, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of completion. This day had perfectly captured the relationship between crown and people that had sustained her throughout her reign. After the final balcony appearance, as the crowds slowly dispersed and the palace returned to quiet, Elizabeth gathered with her family for a private reflection on the day's events. They shared stories about moments they had observed, from touching individual interactions to the overwhelming enthusiasm of crowds. "Mother," Prince Charles said as they sat together in the family sitting room, "today showed that everything you've worked for over 50 years has been worthwhile. The affection and respect people showed wasn't just ceremonial. It was genuine gratitude for a lifetime of service." Elizabeth smiled, feeling tired but fulfilled. "The monarchy doesn't belong to us," she replied. "We're simply its custodians, responsible for maintaining its dignity and ensuring its service to the people. Today showed that when we fulfill that responsibility, the institution remains strong and valued." As she prepared for bed that evening, Elizabeth reviewed the day's events one final time. The overwhelming success of the Jubilee had demonstrated that the monarchy remained relevant and beloved after 50 years of dramatic social change. More importantly, it had shown that the values she represented, duty, service, and dedication to others, still resonated with people of all ages and backgrounds. She said her prayers with particular gratitude that night, thanking God for the opportunity to serve and for the strength to fulfill her duties for so many years. As she reflected on the day's celebrations, she felt confident that the monarchy would continue to evolve and serve future generations, guided by the same principles that had sustained it through the triumphs and challenges of her remarkable 50-year reign. The Jubilee had been more than a celebration. It had been a reaffirmation of the covenant between crown and people that would endure long after Elizabeth herself had passed into history. The constant and loyal queen had been recognized, but more importantly, the enduring strength of the institution she served had been celebrated by a grateful nation.